then as we went through the unit, we would go and look at the info in supporting question 1. And at the end of that whole lesson, I would give them like just 2-3 minutes at the end and say, okay, pull up this document again, because it was housed in Google Classroom. It wasn't something they needed to, it wasn't like a notebook they needed to hang on to. It wasn't a file in their computer, something they could just go straight to in Google Classroom. Okay, after completing supporting question 1, now what's your definition of worth based on those fights for the right to vote? And had them reflect, was there any information from this lesson that changed or reinforced your definition? And for each supporting question, I had them do that. And then when it came time for the summative, which was it was writing a paragraph answering that question, writing a claim. Again, central to that was the first thing I had them do was define the word worth to help them to determine where they were going to go with this compelling question. And so that was just like one way that I had them interacting with the question, because for me, I will spend too much time, some people say, having my students interact with the compelling and supporting questions. But I think it's so important, especially when you have a word like worth, or we're using the word authority right now, and just having the kids really determine their definition of that question, which will, it'll give them the freedom when they're doing the summative or when they're creating their argument to kind of go any direction they want. But it also kind of, a second benefit is it makes it a little bit more interesting for us as teachers, because we're getting, as their thinking develops, we tend to get more different writing samples as opposed to just the same essay over and over, the same claim or the same paragraph over and over and over. So that's a huge benefit from this as we were going through. And then another thing I just wanted to show is just don't be afraid. And I'll bring up some Jamboard stuff here every once in a while, but don't be afraid to have your students interact as a class. What does the word worth mean to you? And a lot of the time, this was after the first day, but they talked about money and does it cost much? How hard is it to do something? But money showed up a lot. And another thing that I use, I don't know if anyone uses poll everywhere, but I like to use that. Just it's got a bunch of cool functions, but one of them, it just has this like a word association activity where you just type in like worth, and they just they can text or type in one or two words that go with that term worth. And it just, if you're like graphically minded, it brings up a cool graphic like this, and I use that a lot because it does live updates. So that's just another thing that I use to help like the class collect their thinking. So next, how do students in courses? So one thing I always do, and I'm sorry this is so blurry, I didn't think it didn't look so blurry when I was talking through this last night. But one thing that I did is I put all of the sources on either a Google Doc or a Google slide. And I'll show you why I do the Google slides sometime. But this, if you can see it, this is just, it's a primary source document. And I think about how when we're like co-planning and creating things with other teachers, what do? We send them a Google Doc and say, okay, just comment and give me your feedback. And so I always think of it like, why can't we have our kids annotate that way? And so one thing that I just encourage my students to do, and this is just a screenshot of one student, just their annotations. I just had them just highlight and comment. And then a couple other things I would do is just, if you find a main idea, highlight it in a different color. But here, this is a conversation. This is a world history example. It was a conversation about people in Mongol China, actually, and it was a very religiously open community. And so this is people from Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam having a conversation. It was just making some random, this isn't like A+ work, but this is him interacting with the document. And so like here, they use the word secretary. He's like, what do you mean secretaries? Like people who take notes. Here they're talking about getting all these religious leaders together, and he says, oh, I wonder if they're going to fight. So again, there's just some, at least I know this kid's reading and interacting with the source. And some of the annotations were much more in-depth and scholarly, but I thought this was a good example just from a kid who, I knew he was interacting with this and he was getting something from it. So that's just another way that I encourage my students to interact with their sources. And just if you want to think about it
quickly, there's a question in the chat. Do you use a particular format when you're coaching students in their paragraph writing? The 3.8 is one that's mentioned and is pretty popular. But if you use another, this person, Jeremy, would be interested in some other paragraphing structures, just in case you use any others other than 3.8.
Yeah, I mean, right now I'm just coaching them on just general, like, for every piece of evidence, have a piece of reasoning. But so there's nothing, I don't think there's anything exceptional or different that I do with the paragraph coaching. I know Megan's going to get a little bit of she's going to be talking about claim evidence reasoning a lot. So there's going to be a little bit more of that type of interaction with her part. But yeah, I mean, I just use pretty general stuff like that as well. So yes, sorry to not be able to take that a little further, but I'm always willing to, have a follow-up conversation about specifically what I do. Another thing I thought about, thanks for that question. Thanks for pointing that out. Because I'm definitely not seeing the chat right now. So while I was making this presentation, I was trying to figure out if I can get the kids to interact with a picture. And it's kind of hard in the Google Doc because you can highlight the entire picture and comment on it. But I was like, I wonder what else you could do. And so this is my example. This is my annotation, sorry. But if you put a picture into a Google slide, you can throw in like shapes and arrows and things like that and highlights, and you can actually comment on the shapes. So this is something I just thought this up, and I don't, again, maybe others have thought of it, but I thought this up like 2 days ago. So I haven't been able to try it in my classroom yet, but I'm going to be trying this out because I'm using a lot of images and just saying, okay, point an arrow at something and comment on it. Tell me what your question, what your comment is about that. So just kind of like one example of what this could look like. Because again, finding ways to have my students show that they're interacting with these documents is so important. And really them actually interacting is so important. So that's just a couple things that I do. I pretty much do everything in Google Docs and Google Slides, or you'll see in Google Forms. And then finally, how do students interact through tasks? And so I'm just going to show a couple examples of formative, summative tasks. And again, Megan's going to get a little bit more into developing claims and connecting evidence and claims and things like that. But just a couple things I've done, and just an example, this is a Google form that I'll do. And what I want to point out here is that, I'm putting the documents in the Google form. And this is like, I like to use Google Forms for like collecting data. So even if it's a document they've seen in a doc, like this is somewhere where, because you can develop that good spreadsheet and collect the data pretty succinctly. So what I always do when I'm doing a Google form is I'll have the document and make sure I'll have a couple of disciplinary literacy questions, and I never try to shy away, and they're hard to develop sometime, but those critical literacy questions where the kids are actually, questioning the sources, questioning the impact that they might have on current thinking or thinking at that time. And so, just this is an example of an Egyptian creation story, and, the critical literacy questions. I think, how did this source, was it informed by cultural context or place? And so, again, this is just an example of like how I'm collecting like that formative and summative data. So sometimes I'll put the same documents that they're interacting with up here into here, but just give them a couple of different of those disciplinary or critical literacy questions, just so I can collect that data and bring it into my PLC. Organizational tasks. Another thing I do, and this seems like it's a lot of documents I'm having my students work with, but really it ends up being like 2. But what I'll do is I'll look at the whole unit and think, okay, what are the organizational tasks that they're going to be doing throughout this unit? So if it's a T-chart, a Venn diagram, just creating a list. I'll create just kind of like that worth definition document. I'll create a tracking document that they can have for the whole unit that doesn't have like a due date or a grade attached to it, but just somewhere where, okay, if for supporting question 1, they're going to be doing a T-chart, I'll create the T-chart for them. I'll create the Venn diagram for them. And I'll say, okay, now go to your tracking document and go to supporting question 1. Here's your Venn diagram. So this is just an example of the student from a previous unit that we did. Actually, this was our the inquiry that our article was based on, but this is from the 2020 protest unit. And this is just one of the slides, and you can see down there, there's a second Venn diagram because they were doing 2 with that unit. So that's one thing I have my students track that, and I just give them that spot in Google Classroom to keep any thinking that I want them to track throughout the unit. And then finally, just encouraging students to interact. Just don't forget Jamboard, Padlet, breakout rooms, class message boards. I always just say, like, is even if, for me, like, depending on the class period, I'll have anywhere from like, well, I'm not going to get into the numbers of students I have, but from low to high numbers of students. So sometimes breakout rooms aren't always possible, but, having, creating a Jamboard and leaving it open for the kids to work on for a couple of days, a Padlet, class message boards. Just, I always say, like, find ways to encourage interaction, because inquiry and, especially nowadays, like, education should not be done solo. So I said, don't be afraid, like, to, sometimes I'll give the kids like the same document and say, okay, all 4, here's 4 kids, here's a link to a document. All 4 of you start annotating, just talk among each other about this document. And I'll do the same thing with an image or things like that. So don't be afraid to encourage that with your students as well. And then just like final thing I'm going to mention is, like, what can the entire unit look like? So here, if you use that compelling question of what is the vote worth, the staging activity, and this is, just a quick IDM overview, but the staging activity would be having them fill out that worth document, talking about it among their class in the chat. And then also having like a class Jamboard that they're just putting that definition of worth throughout the course of the unit. And then supporting question 1, and I'm just showing you just a couple things that, like, how this would all connect. So for supporting question 1, you might have them annotate primary sources by themselves with that Google Doc, like I mentioned, and then create a T-chart and fill side of with a list of historic barriers to voting. So that's all you can do, and you can do that all, again, within Google Classroom and Google Docs and things like that. And then maybe for supporting question 2, you would assign 3 to 4 students to one primary source, have them annotate and discuss that one source, because you can just drop a link into a chat or into a Google Classroom and have like 4 students working on one source. Then have them collaborate to fill in a T-chart with modern barriers. So then all of a sudden they're going to have a T-chart that has historic barriers on one side and modern barriers on the other side. And then you could always have them like create a class T-chart on a Padlet, on a Jamboard, whatever, to collect data from all the sources. And then when they're looking at the history of the close elections, you may just want to collect data from that. So you could complete a Google form that has like all these election results where they're just answering disciplinary and critical literacy questions about these elections. And then their summative argument would be to complete that Google Doc that walks them through answering that question of what is a vote worth. So that's just a quick unit overview. And again, any of this stuff, I know I kind of flew through it, but I'm happy to talk more in depth about it. So that's just a quick overview of some specific things that I've seen work in my classroom. And then again, we'll have time for questions, but I'm going to hand it over to Megan because she's doing some very, very cool stuff with claim evidence reasoning that I'm eager to hear about. I guess I have control of the presentation, so just...
Okay, I'll tell you when to switch through. So what I wanted to talk to you a little bit about is what can or what could claim evidence and reasoning look like in your classroom. And I feel like I should say, like, I'm a convert to inquiry. I like it. It's taken me years to kind of adjust to it, but I think it's completely transformed what's happening in my classroom on a daily basis. And it's transformed what students from a variety of ability levels are able to do. Now, the obvious catch with that is all of this works in my classroom. And so to try to figure out how to make this happen in remote learning has been really challenging. And so I've tried to go to a more simplistic level. I teach sophomores for US history. That's where it's required in my school district. And we don't have, all the classes are mixed ability. So I have a range. We don't offer AP US history or honors. So I have a range of students in my class. And they are students who went home last year at spring break and didn't come back to school. So they haven't had a lot of experience with claim evidence reasoning or with inquiry skills in general. And US history was supposed to be their introduction. So I'm starting with students who don't have a good foundation, and I'm trying to provide that foundation remotely. So there are obviously practical concerns, and I don't want to pretend like that doesn't exist, but I want to try to offer you some maybe ideas that you could adjust or adapt to whatever content you have or whatever platform you're using. When my school district started working with inquiry, we had a required inquiry. We had 3 units per semester, and we had 1 required inquiry that you had to do. And my first round through it, I felt like I did inquiry for 2 or 3 weeks. And then the remaining 5 weeks of the unit, I was doing what I used to do. And so it felt really disconnected and disjointed. And so I was trying to figure out how to make inquiry happen all the time, even when a formal inquiry, we weren't working with a formal inquiry. And, you know, I was lamenting about this problem to Dr. Swan, and she provided this math analogy that has always like stuck with me. So she said in math class, you know, we all remember that class. We're social studies teachers probably for a reason, but, you know, your teacher taught you a little bit and then you did practice problems, and you did practice problems every single day. And nobody would tell a math teacher, don't do practice problems, don't do guided practice, don't have them do practice. That's an expectation because that's how you get good at math. And so I think about claim evidence reasoning as something that my students need practice with every day, not just on the days we're doing inquiry, in order to be able to be successful at that actual formal inquiry that we're going to do. Andrew, if you can forward to the next slide. So I know we probably spend a lot of time thinking about claims. At least that's what I did in my first couple of years with inquiry. It was all about the claim. And at the end of the year, they could make good claims. Some of them could make good claims. But in terms of the rest of the argument, it felt like I had left that part behind. And so sometimes it feels like making a claim gets really repetitive. It's just make a claim, make a claim, make a claim. So I wanted to show you some different ways for using evidence that are a little bit different, a little bit more structured. And I think I'll mention, but it's pretty obvious how you could add a claim in there or add the reasoning in there. So I've taken on a daily basis the ideas of CER, and I've tried to break down what that looks like. So if thinking about evidence, in the end, I want my students to be able to make their own claim, to find evidence from multiple sources, and to provide the reasoning to explain that. But if I work my way backwards, before I can ask them to do that, I need them to be able to match evidence to a provided claim. So here's evidence that's provided to you. Which claim does it match? Then I want students to be able to find evidence to support a claim that I have given them. And I want students to be able to break down an author's argument. And so to me, these are the skills, the foundational skills that students need to do in kind of escalating level of difficulty before I can ask them to do their own arguments. If I'm thinking about like that 3.8 model where I'm asking them to do something more formal in writing. So what I have been trying to do on a daily basis during remote learning is to work in evidence practice. My students really don't have a lot of inquiry skills. And again, I don't blame them for that. That's what my job is, to teach them. But given where we're at home with the internet, sometimes without the internet, sometimes, you know, it's really difficult to ask them to do some of that, I think, more sophisticated work. If I'm a student by myself and I'm asked to do a 3.8 paragraph, well, what happens when I can't find my second piece of evidence? Then I quit, and there's no teacher there to say, hey, like, let me help you work through it. So I've tried to find smaller activities that are still meaningful for my students, in terms of practicing those inquiry skills, but that hopefully don't feel as daunting for them. The other thing I want to say here is, we might towards the end of the semester go all the way back to matching evidence to an appropriate claim. And it's just that I've adjusted the level of difficulty of a source, or I've adjusted the level of difficulty of a claim. So my students are working with these basic skills. We'll see that claims and reasoning show up too, but we've been focusing a lot on evidence since it's kind of, the beginning of the year, even though it's the end of October here. But you can always make adjustments, whether it be for the whole class on adjusting the sources or the claim, or if that's how you're going to differentiate. So Andrew, if you want to forward to the next slide, I wanted to kind of show you a couple examples of what this actually looks like in a way that I hope you might see as being transferable to your class. So the inquiry for our first unit is, why was the United States on the winning side of World War II? That's our big compelling question. And then our supporting questions lead students through the war in Europe, the home front, until we get to the end of the unit with the Pacific. And so our supporting question is, what contributions, or why did the United States win in the Pacific? Why were we able to win? And so this is an activity where I have provided students with claims. These aren't the most sophisticated claims. These aren't like A+++ claims, but they're trying to get students to see some of the basic claim work. So a claim isn't a complete sentence. A claim is something that can be defendable. A claim is something that is accurate. And while, it obviously depends on the students you're working with, but those basic aspects of a claim are often not met by my students. So to get them some repetition of seeing good claims, and again, you can make the claims as fancy as you want or as appropriate for your students. So what my students were given is, they were given an image bank, and they had these 3 claims. And so they had to sort through the images to find out which image could fit each claim. So there's a level of matching here, right? So you have to figure out which picture. Again, if I'm telling my students, I'm often saying, find the picture that fits. But in real academic language, it's find the primary source that can be used as evidence for the claim. And then they have to explain how that image supports the claim. And this is that idea of reasoning, of explaining your evidence. I like to use pictures too, because when you use a primary source text, oftentimes students struggle to summarize. They put the text here. But with an image, they can't just replicate the image. They have to describe, they have to summarize, they have to use their own words. So if Andrew can flip to the next slide, here are a couple of images that were in the image set, and multiple images could be used effectively. Andrew, one more slide shows you a good match. So the third claim asks students to find an image to support the idea that geographic factors complicated battles in the Pacific theater. And so they might pick this image, and they might explain that you can see in this image, regardless of what you know about military tactics, that there are soldiers wading through water and you can see land in the background. So this idea that, unlike some of the battles that happen in Europe, say after D-Day, when the Allies already have established a beachhead, here you've got soldiers who are attacking islands, and you have the logistics challenge of moving from ships to get your soldiers to sea, and that's a complication. And then the students can think about, how difficult is this? Are these soldiers just there to be picked off because they're standing in the water without any supports? And so it can kind of help get the students thinking about how evidence can be used to support a claim in a much less threatening way. So you could give this to your students in a Google Doc and have them do it asynchronously. I had a class where I put them in breakout rooms, and I assigned each breakout room one of the 3 claims, and then they had to present when they came back in as a whole class which image they picked. Everyone had the same image set, so they were familiar with the images, but they wouldn't have picked the same images based on the claims that I created. Sometimes it's not possible. I have sections where people refuse to speak. And so asking students to share or present is not possible. But this is an activity that you can do completely asynchronously if you wanted. In one of my sections, I had students do it independently, and then I pulled a good example and a bad example. And the next day when we had a live session, we reviewed what made the good one good and what made the bad one bad, just to kind of reinforce what good evidence looks like. Andrew, the next example is going to be a way to have students find evidence to support, again, a claim that's provided from kind of a more zoomed out idea. So my students read the graphic novels March by John Lewis about his life. And I ask them to use the graphic novels as their evidence to provide support for a variety of claims. So this would be something that we did after we had read the graphic novel, but I wanted to show you an example of what differentiating a claim or increasing the level of difficulty could look like. So my lower level students got claims 1 and 2, the yellow side, and my higher level students got claims 3 and 4. And claims 1 and 3 are essentially the same. Students would pick the same kind of evidence from the graphic novel to use to support these claims, but the wording of the claim is much more accessible, I think, for lower level students in claim 1. So find me evidence, find examples in the graphic novels where John Lewis did not agree with the decisions of other leaders of the civil rights movements. Or claim 3 for my more advanced students, there's internal disagreement among civil rights activists on how to achieve equality. So thinking about an activity that can be really straightforward, it's not make the claim, which can be difficult for students depending on the scope or the sequence of your sources, but it's just that idea about finding evidence. On the next slide, I kind of show an example that maybe answers Jeremy's question earlier about writing. Andrew, if you can forward one more slide. What I often have my students do instead of writing a full paragraph is I make them fill out an outline, incomplete sentences, which is essentially writing a full paragraph. But in their minds, they did not have to write a full paragraph. So I like using this format where the claim is at the top, you put your evidence on the left, and you explain your reasoning on the right. And I've added some prompts here to try to get students to make sure that they are, in explaining their evidence, they're actually showing how it defends the claim. So in our Cold War unit, the students had to break down secondary sources to break down the author's argument. And so for some of my students, I asked them each of the pieces, sorry, I should go back a step. Each of the pieces was from a different historian who had a different argument about why the Cold War started and who was to blame. So our essential question, our compelling question was who was to blame for the Cold War? And so sometimes my students weren't capable of being able to make a claim on their own. So in this instance, I provided them the claim. The historian argues that Stalin's to blame for the Cold War. And so then the students have to, from that one-page passage that's heavily excerpted and modified, have to find some evidence that the author provides. So again, kind of this bridge to making your own argument is to break down or explain an author's existing argument to show you what that looks like. So sometimes, Jeremy, I might have my students do all of this in complete sentences. So if I took away the scaffolding, they've written a paragraph. But again, in their minds, they haven't written the paragraph. Sometimes when we get towards the end of the semester, it'll be this grid, but it'll be empty. And so they will have to fill it in themselves in that paragraph form. But for me, it's a lot easier to check because I can see if my students know what the evidence is, rather than the evidence is just somewhere in the paragraph and I'm the one saying this is the evidence. This format forces my students to be defining for me, this is what I think the evidence is because it's in the evidence box. And this is what I think the reasoning is because it's in the reasoning box. Because I found over time, a lot of my students don't know the difference. And they just kind of get lucky, if you will. And then I do, this is like a really small hack maybe, but might be helpful. I always put these little yellow boxes for my students to type in. So at a glance, when I look at their document in Google Classroom, I can see if they actually did typing or if all the typing is just mine. And so it's a really quick way on that Google Classroom screen where you just see the little snippet, the little icon of everyone's assignment, if they actually did anything. And it also, for remote learning, shows them like, this is where you have to put the answer. And if you didn't put anything, it means you skipped that question. Okay, so we just wanted to kind of show you a couple examples that we thought were accessible regardless of the content that you were talking about. And we wanted to leave a few minutes for questions. So Andrew, if you're good, maybe we can just open it up to questions. This is like in class, right? Except you all have your cameras on, and I'm hoping you're here, unlike in a real hybrid scenario. But if you want to use the chat, we're happy to answer questions that way, or if you want to just ask them. We also got asked if we could share the presentation, and we'd be happy to share the slides with you. This is a good question. So how can these forms be modified to use in Canvas as we cannot use Google Classroom? I don't know what Canvas is. Andrew, can you take this one?
Canvas is a learning management system, much like Blackboard or
Okay.
Schoology. It's pretty common amongst high schools and colleges.
I've used it before, but just as a student. Does it work well with Google Docs, or does it work better with Microsoft? Because you can, again, the same types of things. There's that ability to comment and to annotate and to create that way. But I've never, unfortunately, in Shelby County, we're just starting to use Schoology a little bit, so that's the only other LMS I've ever used.
No.
Yeah, I think they moved away from that anyway. But then everything else I've done has been in Google Classroom.
Well,
I'll be honest too, if I'm in person.
When I took my training in Canvas, I had to sign my name in blood in a book. So I don't like it. It doesn't work well. It doesn't sync with Infinite Campus correctly all the time. At least at this point in my experience, it is double the work, if not triple the work. And I don't have a lot of free time to spare. But I love the way you've got your thing set up for the claim and the evidence and putting in the reasoning and a yellow box for the kids to write in. I think that's amazing and would love to try that. But I don't know if Canvas will allow me to. That's why I asked that question, because it may just throw it away and I would never see it again if I put it in there.
Yeah, I'm sorry that we can't help you with that one. I know in person, I do the same thing on a worksheet. So if you eventually find yourself face to face again, you could do it. You could have the kids handwrite it. But yeah, I'm not sure. I'm sorry. Maybe someone else in the session knows and could throw in the chat if you have any good Canvas hacks.
Well, I just wondered if we did it in a Google Doc or on a Google slide or in a Google Doc, and then instead of leaving using a text box for students to write in, if we could do a one cell table, if so to speak, and use the yellow behind that, because the table will expand as the students write. And it, at least in my theory, may not be right, but in my theory, it would at least mimic. But you know, I don't know anything. Thank you so much.
Do any of us know anything right now with remote learning? But it sounds like you have some ideas. Yeah, some workaround ideas. Andrew, could you put a shared link to the slides, maybe just in the chat?
Yeah.
And as you're doing that, if there's any final questions, after this session is over, we'll have about 10 minutes to transition to the next. But if there's any questions for Andrew or Megan, you can put them in the chat or ask them now before we finish up.
We also put our email addresses at the end here. So if something comes up tomorrow or a week from now when you have a chance to kind of breathe, please feel free to email us. We'd be happy to answer questions that way too.
All right, well, thank you everyone for attending this session. Andrew and Megan, it was awesome. You guys did a great job. Andrew is running for KCSS president. So this is just a reminder to cast your vote and in the spirit of democracy within our own organization. Again, remember to visit the vendor hall. You can do that during, or the vendor session, the Zoom link. You can do that during lunch or during one of your sessions. There's lots of vendors to engage with. But thank you, Megan and Andrew. This session was awesome. And we can go ahead and transition to the next session, session 2. Everyone's got about 10 minutes to take a restroom break, get coffee, put on a sweater, go pet your dogs, any of those things. And we'll see you guys in session 2. That was really awesome, you guys.
Thanks, Maddie.
Yeah, thanks.
I don't often see that many adults like engaged in taking notes in a session. It was clearly something people were very interested in. So thank you guys for doing this session. It was really good.
Thanks. I think
Thank
you gave
you.
us the prime spot where they're still full of energy too. So thanks. All right. I assume you're using this room again for another session.
Not until session 3, but we have, like I said, we have a little bit of time, so you're not like kicked out or anything.
Okay. Oh, there is a folder, right? That should probably drop that presentation in, or is there?